The Fall 2020 Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher Parent Empowerment Conference. Realities for a New Reality. 2 days, 25 workshops, renowned speakers and presenters, by families, for families, nearly 40 hours of unfiltered and straightforward information, made possible by the leaders in disability rights advocacy for over 45 years, Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher, attorneys at law. So welcome to this session of our ongoing encore presentation series of the Fall 2020 Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher Parent Empowerment Conference.
Okay, all right, perfect. I'm going to get started. So I know we're starting late. We'll try to get going, get as much done as we can during this time. So everybody's muted. So what I'm going to try to do, though, maybe hopefully at the end, I'm going to try to have it so that we have time at the end for questions. So I'm going to try to open it up. So unmute everybody at the end, and then give you the opportunity, hopefully, to unmute yourself so that you can ask questions. Because I really want to try to make this, because we don't have that many people, to be able to make this as interactive as possible. And as I'm talking, at some point, I'm happy, like as we see how many people sort of enter, I'm happy to unmute you guys the whole time. I just want to make sure that if I unmute you, if anybody has background noise in the background, then I would like you to be able to then just mute yourselves. Because I've done a presentation before where I didn't mute everybody, and then it was like a disaster with people talking on the phones and like noise in the background. So I just want to make sure that we have this so that everybody can get the information that they want. But I really want to make this helpful for you. So I'd like to be able, with a small group, be able to make this interactive. So maybe I'll try to get going a bit into it, and then what we'll do is, first of all, with your kids, is normalizing the fears. Because we want to be able to recognize that it's important to recognize, that fears are expected, right? We're all nervous about some of these things, but where we want to change it is to change the catastrophizing. And that's going to be an important thing that we're going to talk about, is like, how do we change the catastrophizing, where we sort of let that snowball spiral out of control. So learning to cope with these unknowns is the important goal. Identifying steps that we each take to keep ourselves safe. Like, what happens? Like, what do we do to keep ourselves safe? Talking about these specific things. How do we find creative ways to connect with others? Problem solving, that isolation, coming up with plans to connect. If we have to social distance with our friends, what are the ways that we're able to do that? Correcting inaccurate information regarding transmission and risk, because that is one thing that becomes important, is that what are our kids hearing about? What are they thinking about the risk about being in school, and how does the virus get transmitted? And also, what is our inherent risk? And each of our families have to make those decisions when we make that. So each of us are in different circumstances based upon who we live with, and what our health conditions are. And so that's why it's not a one-size-fits-all model with risk. So every family has to make those decisions. So some families are deciding, look, I'm at high risk, so I'm not going to send my kids to school. And other families are not at high risk and are going to be able to send their kids to school. And so those are all important conversations, but we have to help our kids be able to understand that we don't want to catastrophize the circumstances, but we also want to talk about ways to be able to keep ourselves safe by having healthy, safe behaviors. So managing worry. The first step to help your child is to recognize the need to not tell them what to think. As parents, one of the things that we do a lot of is tell them, right? We reassure. We say like, oh, it's all going to be okay. Just think that you can do it. It'll work out. And think about like how that doesn't work. Like, think about a time for yourselves when you were going through a difficult time. And did you have somebody tell you, oh, it'll all work out okay? So I'm sure, like, I know I have. Like, I've had somebody say that to me before. And was that helpful? Because I know for me that wasn't helpful. So when somebody just tells you, oh, it's all going to work out, like those platitudes, like, just don't work, because you don't believe it, because there's no evidence behind it. So you're worried about something and someone just tells you, oh, it's going to work out okay. That doesn't help you feel better, because they're not helping you see the reasoning why it might work out okay. And so that's the same thing as parents when we just tell our kids that everything's going to work out okay, or not to worry, or that you're going to be fine, that it doesn't help manage their worry, right? So they rely on us. I mean, the one part of it that's a problem is that they rely on us to then reassure them all the time. That's one negative side of doing that. The second thing is that it oftentimes doesn't work because they're just words. They go in one ear and out the other for kids because they don't believe it because you didn't help them get there. And so we need to change this by asking questions. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that. We ask questions to help the individual see how they can handle the situation successfully rather than just giving reassurance. We want them to be able to figure out the ways that they can help themselves get to that point of believing their ability to be able to handle those situations. So let's talk a little bit about just anxiety in general. How do we view anxiety? How do we sort of help you to be able to see that you can, how do we understand anxiety in general to be able to then learn how do we intervene in different ways of anxiety? So the first thing is, we call it the triple response system. So anxiety intervenes in three spheres. We have thoughts, we have our feelings, which is our physiology, and we have our actions, which is behavior. And if we look at the next slide, we have how they interconnect. So thoughts, actions, feelings, you can see the double arrows going in each direction. So the point is that when we get anxious, it could start in any sphere. So it might start in the feelings. So physiologically, I might get an upset stomach, I might get my heart racing, or maybe it starts in my thoughts. So let's say I was worried about let's say being on camera, in the classroom. So say, like being at home and having to be on camera. And my thought is, oh gosh, everyone's going to see me and like be staring at me on camera. And so that thought, what is that going to do? Then the arrow is going to go to my feelings and maybe my heart's going to start racing. And then what happens when my heart starts racing, it's going to lead to my thoughts saying like, oh no, I can't do this. This is not going to be comfortable. I'm not going to want to be on camera. I don't want to be in front of everybody. So what does that do to my thoughts? It leads to my feelings being more anxious. And then what does it do to my actions? I'm going to turn off my camera. I don't want to be on camera. It's not going to be helpful. Like I'm going to be really uncomfortable. And then it's going to lead to more negative feelings and then more negative thoughts. And it spirals up out of control so that our anxiety increases. And so what we really want to be able to do is teach our kids how to intervene in the thoughts, in the feelings, and in the actions to be able to, again, not eliminate anxiety. That is never the goal because that is not going to be reasonable to eliminate anxiety in our lives. But it's the idea to manage anxiety, to keep it from spiraling up. So to help the physical sensations of anxiety, there's two different ways to be able to do that. One is through breathing and one is through relaxation. And again, we're not going to eliminate all physical symptoms of anxiety. I mean, it's just a natural part of life. It's just the idea is that if we can learn how to breathe, we call it diaphragmatic breathing. If we can change our breathing, then one of the things that we could do is be able to lower the physical sensations. Because what happens is when we get anxious, we end up starting to breathe more rapidly. And when we breathe more rapidly, it brings on some of the other physical sensations of anxiety. And so it's sort of like when we hyperventilate, we end up feeling that we're not able to get enough oxygen, but the reality is you're getting too much oxygen. So we need to slow our breathing down in order to be able to balance out the oxygen carbon dioxide supply in our bloodstream so it evens it out, and then it doesn't bring on some of the other panic symptoms that goes along with it. And then the other part of it is relaxation. Relaxation is there's so many different relaxation apps, and so individuals can sometimes use those. Some especially young kids don't really like to relax, so I mean that's not something I typically do with young kids, but teenagers and young adults typically might enjoy more relaxation apps and like using them to be able to help themselves relax and before going to school or maybe after school to be able to help them through the process of just being in a better mind space. So for diaphragmatic breathing, one of the things that you want to be able to do is be able to take slow, deep breaths. So the idea becomes to be able to breathe through your diaphragm rather than breathing shallowly through your chest. So when most people take a deep breath, they suck in their belly, they stick out their chest, and it's a very shallow breath. And so diaphragmatic breathing is actually when if everybody does it, and they put one hand on their stomach and one hand on their chest, one of the things that you want to do is you want to have your bottom hand move more than your top hand. So you're going to blow air more into your belly. So it doesn't feel very comfortable at first because it doesn't, like most people don't blow air down into their belly. So the idea though is like to take a deeper, slower breath. So you're going to, if you give me a second, you're going to see that you're not going to see my bottom hand just because the way the camera is probably situated. But I'm blowing air into my bottom hand and then sort of letting it out slowly. So if everybody tries that for a second, and you could try to see if you try to move your bottom hand. And so the idea is that you allow yourself to be able to practice that in a slow way. And the goal is to get between 10 and 12 breaths in a minute. And this way you try to see that you're trying to get, so it's like 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. And that's sort of the goal of learning to breathe in a more relaxed state. So for young kids, I don't expect them to do diaphragmatic breathing. So for young kids, what I'll do is typically I'll tell them to pick like their favorite food. So if they say their favorite food is pizza, I say, great. So we're going to stop and smell the pizza. We take a deep breath and let's smell the pizza. And smell the pizza. Oh, pizza smells so good. It smells delicious. Breathe that all in, the sauce, the cheese, the spices. Oh, it smells delicious. And now the pizza's too hot to eat right now. So you're gonna have to take a good breath and blow on it to cool off the pizza. So now take a deep breath and really blow on that pizza to cool it off. And so what does that do? It brings on the same kind of sensation by doing that. But let's say they pick a food that's not hot. Like let's say they say an ice cream sundae. So one of the things that I'll say is, okay, breathe and smell the hot fudge, smell the whipped cream and the ice cream. Oh, that smells so good. Smell the chocolate. And now blow out the birthday candles. And then take that deep breath and blow them all out in one fell swoop and blow all those candles out. So what happens is what? They're doing all of that to be able to help themselves see that. So the idea is that you're teaching them just different ways of using their breathing without having to just do straight diaphragmatic breathing. So it's just different strategies that we could use with kids. With kids, you could also, there's so many different ways that you could do it. I've done it with like where you blow a cotton ball across the table to practice like doing the breath. So physically, like being able to see things move can sometimes be helpful. So before we get into the thoughts, I mean, the idea is the idea for anxiety is that the problem is the selective attention is just to stimuli that indicate possible danger. And what happens? Then we become hypervigilant. And we dwell on thoughts of catastrophe, we exaggerate worst case scenario, and then what happens to that? Then we think that danger is imminent. And then what does that lead to? We're constantly on guard, we're constantly in a state of emotional distress, then we lead to avoidance, then when we avoid, what do? We feel better, our anxiety goes away. But then what happens? That's negative reinforcement, right? So then we feel better. And so the avoidance behavior is strengthened. So that teaches us to stay away to feel better, which is not what we want to be able to do. So for treatment, what we really want to work on is changing the distorted perceptions or cognitions, which are thoughts, and we want to change the avoidant behaviors. And that becomes really important. So important to change the individual's reaction to the physiological symptoms. So the physical symptoms are not dangerous, so we do not indicate the need to be hypervigilant. So hypervigilance leads to the increased anxiety, but that's where it ends up being. Like, so think about like if you were worried, like think about back into like when you first went to the supermarket that first time, you were going to be more hypervigilant and you were probably more anxious. And then what happened? Like you felt like it was more risky at that point. But the reality is now that you're less hypervigilant, you're less anxious, the danger has not changed. The danger is exactly the same as it was before. What was different? You got used to it and your physical symptoms reduced. So it's the same thing for our kids when they go back to school. We want them to recognize that yes, when they go back, they're going to be uncomfortable. I mean, there's no doubt that it might be uncomfortable. But the reality is that practice gets easier if they change their behaviors. So if they're staying hypervigilant all the time, their anxiety is not going to decrease. If their thoughts are going to continue to feel anxious the entire time and believe that they're in constant danger all the time, then their anxiety is not going to decrease. So we need to be able to change the thoughts, which gets into what we're going to do afterwards. So we rate the fear, it's really good for kids to be able to, for individuals in general, we want to rate the fear from 0 to 10, because it gives us a gauge of like where they are, because all anxiety is not the same. So if their fear is a 5, like the goal is over time, do we get it down to go down eventually, versus if their fear is a 10, we're not going to get it go down to a 1 so quickly, but maybe the goal would be to get it down to move to a 5 for them to feel more comfortable, because a 10 is really, really uncomfortable, but a 5 is more manageable. And so as opposed to if it starts at a 5, well, I can do that. I can manage that, and I can be able to get in. So those are the kinds of things that we want to be able to do to be able to help them. So then we get into the thoughts, the cognitive restructuring. And so the first goal is to identify the anxious thoughts. And I think it becomes really important to help kids to be able to understand what are they thinking about that's causing them to be anxious, and getting at the core thoughts, not just I'm anxious about going to school, because that doesn't give us something to change. But what are you anxious about going to school? Or what are you anxious about being on camera? What are you anxious about asking a question, right? So getting at that core thought is the only way that you're going to help them then change that. So the idea is to be, so oftentimes they're unaware of the anxious thought. They just know they're anxious, or they know they're anxious about asking the question, but then they don't get to the core issue. So the core issue might be, I'm supposed to know the information, like I'm not supposed to not know how to do this. And then they get into panic mode because like, what is the teacher going to think of me that I don't know I don't know how to do this, especially because the teacher doesn't even know me very well because we're not even in person. So the final goal is to change the thought to something that's rational. So it's not the power of positive thinking. And that is so important to realize that, because I think people forget that it's like, oh, I'm just supposed to think positively. No. I mean, thinking just positively is not going to work. Like we can't just say like, okay, I'm going to think happy thoughts. Like we don't believe the happy thoughts, because that's not the reality in life. I mean, right now there's challenging times. And there's risks, and we recognize that there is risks. So it's not just, oh, everything's going to be okay. The point is like, what are the things that we do to keep ourselves safe? We wear masks in school, right? We sanitize, we're social distancing. And by doing those things, do those things keep us safe? And the idea becomes that we take precautions to be able to do things to be able to keep us safe. And so the reality is those are the kinds of things that we use to be more rational in those moments. So there's different ways of being able to do this. I mean, just in the absence of time, I'm going to try to go through these things fairly quickly, but I want to be able to sort of help you be able to sort of say like the ways that we go about challenging those thoughts becomes important by recognizing the different types of thinking mistakes. So we have 9 different thinking mistakes. So the first one is called all or nothing thinking. So all or nothing thinking is where we think of things as extremes. Either it's I'm perfect or I'm a failure. So it's the idea of like, I stumbled, like maybe if I'm talking on camera and I stumbled over my words a little bit, and then what do? I focus in on that I stumbled over my words, and then I'm embarrassed about being on camera. And then what happens is that then that's what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the fact that I messed up. So, or I got some problems wrong on a question, on a test, and I'm focusing on the problems that I got wrong rather than on all the problems that I got right. And so that would be sort of all the all or nothing thinking. Yes, but thinking. Yes, but thinking is where I focus in on, it's sort of like, it's also called disqualifying the positive. Yes, but, yeah, I did well on that, but it was an easy test. Or, yes, they talk to me, but, oh, they're just nice to everybody kind of thing. So that the idea of yes, but it's like it doesn't count. It's like whatever went well doesn't count because there's an explanation, that but after that sentence. Mind reading fits in more for when I'm socially anxious. So mind reading would be I'm assuming other people are thinking things. So that would be a perfect example of the worries over being on camera or being on microphone. So the mind reading is what are other people thinking, or asking a question to the teacher. What is the teacher thinking about me if I have to ask a question? Is it a dumb question? Is she going to think that I'm not smart, or the other kid's going to think it's a dumb question? So that mind reading is I'm assuming other people are thinking things when nobody has said anything to me. Telling the future is where I have a crystal ball. I'm predicting bad things are going to happen as a result, that I'm going to get sick, that people are going to die, that it's, that I can't learn, I can't focus, I'll never get this, whatever the predicting the future is. Emotional reasoning is where I feel it, therefore it must be true. So I feel like things are going to go badly, therefore it's true that it's going to go badly. I feel like I'm going to catch the virus, therefore it's true that it's going to happen. Labeling is where we place a negative label upon ourselves. We call ourselves stupid, we call ourselves inept, we call ourselves dumb, and then we end up walking around with that label. So we call ourselves a loser, and then we're walking around with a big L on our forehead. So we really try to avoid that labeling. Should statements are where we motivate ourselves by shoulds and shouldn'ts, and then what happens is then we end up feeling that we feel guilty because we can't live up to all of our shoulds and shouldn'ts. So we end up feeling that we're inadequate because, like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that, I should have done a better job on that, I should have asked that question, I should have drawn a better picture, whatever that should statement is. Overgeneralizing is where I see something as a never-ending pattern. So I did it before, wrong, and therefore I'm going to keep doing it wrong. So where overgeneralizing is where I stumbled over my words when I gave a presentation, therefore I'm going to keep doing that. So the overgeneralizing would be something where it's like it happened before, therefore it's going to keep happening in a bad way. Catastrophizing is a big one right now. And I think this is like one of the most common ones for right now for catastrophizing is, that snowball that starts at the top of the hill and rolls down the hill and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So catastrophizing related to like our risk. So again, everybody has their own risk. So we're not catastrophizing if you're at really high risk. I mean, then that's not catastrophizing. If you're taking, then you need to take precautions. But for people that aren't, and then sort of thinking about what those risks are and thinking about like how we sort of put things in perspective. And the idea is that we look at things for what they are. So rather than catastrophizing worst case scenario always, we deal with it. And even if, like, let's say things are problematic, it's like, it's sort of like that wait and see kind of thing. And that's the way we want to be rational about things. So like, let's say somebody, has a cold, and then automatically, oh no, I have COVID right away. So the point becomes that do we automatically assume that, or like, what else could it be? Right? Could it just be a cold? Could it just be allergies? Like, what are the different things that we can do rather than making assumptions? So should we get tested? Sure. I mean, lots of people are getting tested for minimal symptoms right now because that's what we do, because we have to think about also being safe with what we do with others, because we know that we don't always have the classic COVID symptoms. But the reality is, does that necessarily mean that we have it? So it's changing those thoughts so we don't go to the catastrophizing mode, with that. So I think it just becomes important is like, how do we keep things more rational until we have more information rather than jumping to those conclusions and jumping to worst case scenario. So we go through a process. So changing our thoughts to be more rational, so not positive, rational, is a 4-step process. We come up with the automatic thought, then we come up with the thinking mistakes in it, then we ask the key questions, then we come up with the rational thought. So it's a 4-step process, those 4 steps. So that's what we want to be able to come to. So these are just key questions we ask ourselves to be able to come up with that rational thought. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. So do I know for certain that blank will happen? Am I 100% sure of these also awful consequences? What evidence do I have that that's going to happen? Does blank have to or equal or lead to blank? Do I have a crystal ball? What's the worst that could happen? And how bad is that? Could there be any other explanations? What's the likelihood that the bad thing's going to happen? This one's related to like mind reading. Does blank's opinion reflect that of everyone else? Let's say someone doesn't like me. And so I would say like, well, does so-and-so's opinion reflect that of everyone else? The so what? Now that one wouldn't be a good one if like, so what if I'm COVID positive, right? So, but the so what might be for so what if I asked like a question that wasn't the best question, right? So is it really so important that my entire future resides with its outcome? Is it really so important or consequential? So we use these questions based upon which one fits. Like if someone's worried about, now that someone's very sick, obviously we're not going to use a so what question. Like that's going to be important to be able to say like, just because they're sick, does that really mean that it's really dangerous right now? I mean, that would be the kind of way that we would sort of ask that question. So what's good is that you can lay it out on a log. So triggering situation, you do the automatic thought, we write it out, and we get the rational thought. And then I have an example that'll show you for younger kids how we do it with younger kids. So let's do an example. So let's say that for a child, this is a common one that I've heard for all kids before they're returning to school. There's no way I can wear a mask all day. Okay, so I'm sure like that is something that maybe you heard your kids say. So what do we have? Cognitive distortions. We have telling the future, right? So it's predicting what's going to happen. It's emotional reasoning, and it's catastrophizing. So let's get to the key questions. What evidence do I have that I can't keep the mask on? Am I 100% sure that I won't get used to it? Does being uncomfortable mean that I can't do it? So we know that wearing a mask all day is definitely not going to be comfortable, right? So that's why I'm asking those questions. So let's come up with then the rational thought, right? So the rational response is, again, I'm not going to say, oh, it's easy. Oh, it's no problem. I can do it, right? Because the point is that it is uncomfortable. So this is what you could see in my rational response is I wrote, it may be uncomfortable to wear the mask, but after a while, I'll probably get used to wearing it. And how many of you realize that that's true, right? Now, we don't like it. I certainly don't like wearing a mask all day, but how many of you have realized that after a while, you do get used to it? I also won't be in school for a full day, so at least it will only be for 4 hours. So most kids are not in school for a full day. And if you are, then you get to take it off for a break to eat lunch. So the idea becomes that so part of that rational thought is understanding that it's not going to be straight through for like a 6-day hour, or sometimes it's only 3 hours that they're wearing the mask. So the idea becomes is what are the ways that you help them talk through it to be able to say, you know what do I do? And then part of that also is that I would say is practice wearing a mask. If you go from having your child never wear a mask to now wearing a mask for 4 hours, well, that's a little unrealistic. So if they're uncomfortable with it or if they're worried about it, you should be experimenting with different types of masks ahead of time. So which ones feel the most comfortable for them, right? Which materials, different ones feel better than others, and then practicing increasing the number of hours that they wear them. And that's what I was having all my patients do before they had to return to school is practice. So they started to feel more confident. And once they started to do that, what happened to their anxiety? Their anxiety started to decrease because they saw, you know what? I didn't like it, but I was able to do it. Rather than thinking about it and just worrying about it, where then I didn't have that confidence about being able to overcome it. So that's the part that you want to be able to think about is how do we go about doing it. So I'm just going to give you some other ones. Now, this is important. You don't just give a rational thought to somebody. So the idea is you saw that there was a process of helping the child get through it. They are an active participant in the process. So if your child says, I can't learn remotely, you're not going to hand them this rational thought. I'm just showing you different examples of ones that might help you get there. But the idea is it's a give and take. It's never just, oh, this is a good rational thought, use this one. Because if they didn't get there themselves, they're not going to believe it. And so it becomes really important for you to be able to see how you help them get there. That's the most important part of it. So learning in person is so I can't learn remotely. So let's say the rational thought could be learning in person is definitely easier. Most of my friends feel the same way. At least now the teachers are meeting with us live online. So it will be much better than it was in the fall, right? So that's a common one that I heard from a lot of students, right? So I can't learn remotely. Well, that's true, right? Like that it's not as easy as in person. Like learning in person is definitely easier, right? But can you not learn at all remotely, right? So most of my friends, so what are we doing? We're normalizing that fear. Most of my friends feel the same way. And so what do we also know? That the remote learning is definitely better than it was in the spring, right? So we know that now the teachers are live. So is that true that, you know what, it is better? So it's not great. It's definitely not what it was, but is it better than it was? So what does that do? It helps with the process of being able to manage that anxiety. I don't like being on camera. Everyone can see me. I have to talk sometimes too, which makes me very uncomfortable. So this again might be an example of people can see and hear me when we're in school too. So the idea is being able to say, well, what's different about on camera and versus when you're in school when they can see you? The pictures of each of us are really small because think about when you're on Zoom, how big is your picture? So how, is it that big that like what can they really see? And now the other question is how much are you paying attention to the other kids' pictures? I'd be asking the child, how much are you paying attention to the other kids' pictures? Are you staring at them the whole time? Are you how much are you actually paying attention? You just told me before that, maybe you're not paying attention 100% during class. How much are you actually paying attention to what everyone's saying and doing the entire time? So the idea is that one then might come in and saying no one is really paying that much attention. So that they might believe that. So what do we do for younger students? So for younger students, I'm not going to be going through that whole process of the 4-step process. They're not going to be able to get that. So I keep it at a much more basic level. So I do it by something called STOP, S-T-O-P. So S can be for scared or sad, T is thoughts, O is other thoughts, and P can be for praise, proud, or pat on the back, depending upon what P word they know. And so basically it's still a give and take, but I'm not doing it with the different thinking mistakes. I'm not doing it with the key questions. We're still doing the thoughts. I'm doing the questioning with them, but I'm not doing it in such a formal way to be able to help them get there. So I want to unmute you guys to be able to see like how you have questions about some of these things before I go on, because this part is like the most, like I feel like where I am now is sort of the most important part. So if anybody, you know, is in a noisy area or feels like it, so please unmute, please mute yourselves then. But I want to be able to open it up because I want this to be a give and take for some of the things while I start talking, because I want people to be able to ask questions. So how do you feel about some of the things that I sort of brought up? Do you feel like some of those things were things that were relevant to your kids? Does anybody have any specific questions about any of those things that I brought up? Okay.
Hey, Dr. Salzman, it's Paul Pryor, not Christina. She had to run out and take care of a technical issue. This will let folks know that I have given everybody the ability to unmute. Even though some people are probably showing their microphones as being muted, you should be able to unmute yourself, which is, and I see some people already have unmuted themselves. So if you have any questions, let them fly.
Because I definitely want to be able to have time. I mean, like in the last 15 minutes, I mean, I have like another 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to talk about different things. But I want to make this so that like, what are your worries? Like, what are your kids' worries? So like, I want to be able to apply some of the STOP related to your kids' worries, or, you know, like using the cognitive restructuring related to your kids that maybe are things that I didn't use, because I want to make it, because it's hard sometimes for people to take this and then apply it like in their real lives. So there was something on the chat. I mean, was that?
There is something on the chat that came to me as the moderator about, and it might be a little bit off topic. There's two actual comments. Is one about, you know, if you have a child who may be anxious about these types of issues, but they're either, you know, nonverbal or less verbal, or they're a little more stoic, you know. Are there any sort of, and they're not really expressive about their fear? What are some of the telltale signs that a parent maybe want to look out for to help them manage that, you know, anxiety that they're not expressing, and how would a parent approach that child in that kind of circumstance?
So it's a really good question. So then we're looking at, if they're not as verbal, I mean, it depends upon like, you know, what are some of the issues. So, you know, if it's a child that, you know, we're looking at their behavior to be able to see some of the signs. So, you know, what are we seeing a change in their behavior that is noticing the anxiety? So avoidance is certainly something, right? So are they giving us a hard time about doing things that maybe before they were willing to do? Are they being more oppositional than maybe they were before? That would be something that would be a sign that maybe something else is bothering them. Is there other behaviors that we're noticing that they seem to be engaging in? Like, are they having trouble sleeping? Is it impacting their eating? Is there other, so we're looking at some other ways that they're communicating in other ways. Are we seeing more tantruming, you know, where before the other things that weren't bothering them? So it becomes important to be able to sort of figure it out. And if they're nonverbal, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge, because obviously the things I'm talking about are going to be for things that we're using for children that are verbal. So it's a matter of being able to have these conversations with kids to be able to sort of see what are ways to be able to help manage some of these things. So then I would sort of do a lot more practice. So like related to the masks, you know, then knowing that if that was something that they're really uncomfortable with, I would do it in very slow increments, like wearing a mask. If I know that they're going to be back at school and they need to wear a mask, I'm going to start early and really just really slowly use that, and maybe use like a lot of praise for them using it, helping encourage them, lots of high fives, and being able to sort of help them feel like successful, and be able to really be able to talk with them about like their success through the process, but also talk about how difficult it is. And I might say, even for myself, like, oh, yeah, I don't really like it when it first goes on me either. Like and then after a little while, like, it does, like you sort of forget about it. So talking it through about how you feel doing these things, because I know when I first put a mask on, yeah, it feels really, really uncomfortable. And you feel like, oh gosh, like you feel like you can't breathe that well. But then after a while, you do get used to it. So being able to talk it through to let them know how you're doing through it helps it. So modeling becomes a big key. So by talking out loud through the modeling process, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, nothing worse when that mask goes on, nothing better when that mask comes off, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, we all want to do that. Okay, I'm going to go on. If you guys have other questions, please jump in. Because I really do want to make sure that I'm helping you guys, like help your kids. I mean, and like obviously everybody, is doing different things with school too. And it's the idea of like, what are those issues? And I think it just becomes like, I tried to highlight the ones that I know my patients are bringing to the table with me. And so those are the ones that I was trying to really address. And it's interesting. I mean, some kids are actually doing better anxiety wise because they're not going to school, and some of their, some of those, but like, and it's interesting that some younger kids, like some of their anxiety that, we all have, are not matching for them. Like they're still worried about their anxiety that has nothing to do with COVID. They're worried about, their thing. So for them, it might be about germs related to something else that has nothing to do with COVID. But it's the idea for them, it's a stomach virus. And so it's the idea of recognizing, wait a minute, you're worried about stomach virus now? Like that's not what anybody's worried about right now. But it's interesting because that was their fear all along. And it's so interesting to be able to think about like how, that recognize that our kids aren't necessarily processing the information the same way we all are. And to be able to recognize that. And so I think it becomes important is to be able to hear what our kids are experiencing and be able to think about that.
There is actually something that just came in, sort of related to what you were just saying, Doctor. A participant is saying, my child's overall anxiety is through the roof about everything. Separation anxiety from me, afraid of me dying or him dying, doesn't want to do anything he used to love, doesn't want to go swimming in the beach because he's afraid of the jellyfish now, doesn't want to swim in the pool because he thinks the pool cleaner is going to suck him up. Afraid if he falls, he's going to bleed to death. Afraid of throwing up blood. Used to love riding his bike, and now he's afraid because he thinks if he's going to get hit by a car. And none of this was present before, and he was very independent before. So I mean, this obviously this child is, getting very anxious about things that, as you said, are beyond COVID. They don't necessarily have anything to do with COVID.
Right. But I think that that's a perfect example of, where arousal impacts then our fear. And that was what I was talking about in the beginning, right? So it's the idea of that physiological symptoms that we have, and it puts us on high alert. So what happens? And it leads us to thinking. But it also, depending upon the age, I don't know how old he is, but also, what you have to recognize is depending upon developmentally where the child is, it starts to, sometimes cognitively where they are, having something like this crisis in our nation, like, it's like we're talking about risk, starts getting you to think about other risk. And sometimes that also just puts the idea in your head that, oh, the danger exists, where before maybe that wasn't on your radar. Like you just weren't thinking about those kinds of things because maybe cognitively you were a little bit younger, and it was just not like in your thought process. And now all of a sudden hearing about people dying, and hearing the numbers, and unfortunately, like, being so much on the news and being in our face all the time, all of a sudden recognizing like oh no, it's like there's danger everywhere. And so this hypervigilance to the fact that there's danger everywhere, and then also mistaking potentially the physical symptoms of indicating danger. And one of the things that I'll talk to kids and adults also all the time, I use the example of what's called like a false alarm. So one of the things that we want to think about is like, let's say, like I always give them the example of, has your smoke detector ever gone off in the house before? And usually people laugh and say yes. And like, okay, when does it go off? Has it ever gone off when like mom or dad has cooked, something and burned something and like it's gone off? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, Okay, so what do? Do you go running out of the house saying, oh no, fire, fire, call the fire department? Is that what you do? Now, most kids say, no, we go and wave the, paper in front of the smoke detector and like wave it away. I'm like, well, why do you do that? Because why? Because we know that not a fire. So what happens? So that alarm goes off, but you don't act like there's a fire because you know that there's no fire. So you don't react. You talk to yourself and realize like, okay, it's just the smoke going. So that's what sort of we need to have happen. So that's the same thing that happens sometimes when physiologically your body reacts. Sometimes it's a false alarm that goes off and your body physically reacts. But if you don't recognize it's a false alarm, you say, oh no, danger. And then all of a sudden your son is saying like risk everywhere. And that's potentially like dangerous everywhere. Danger is in every corner of the world. And so we have to get him to be able to recognize that, wait a second, just because my body is reacting doesn't necessarily mean that that's accurate. It could just be a false alarm. It could just be like that smoke detector going off. And I just have to be able to say, wait a second, is that really what's happening? Like how many times have I gone to the beach and I've been okay? How many times is like all this happened and I've been okay? And those are the kinds of things that we do. So being able to sort of help the person recognize like, how many times have I done this and like, and what's happened each time? And sometimes what I've done is even I've drawn 2 circles. So I'll draw 2 circles for kids and I'll have those circles. And I'll say to them, okay, these are 2 circles. So let's put the dots in. So this circle is every time you've gone to the beach and, you've gotten stung by the jellyfish and had like a really bad reaction, right? So, you died, because obviously we could get stung by a jellyfish. And this is all the times that like we went to the beach and either we got stung and it just hurt or we didn't get, or nothing happened. And so put the dots in the circles, right? So clearly the child didn't die. So nothing's going to go in that circle, and you're going to have some circles there. And you can even have 3 circles. How many times did you get stung and how many times did you not get stung? So maybe there'll be 1 or 2 times that you got stung, lots and lots of times that you never got stung and no times obviously that you died. So physically seeing those circles sometimes can help process that because probability is a hard concept to explain to kids. And so sometimes the physically seeing it can sometimes sink in a little bit better too. But I think for your son, when they're seeing danger everywhere, I mean, that and it's interfering in his life, I mean, that might be the time that you might want to have him talk to somebody to learn strategies, because I think it becomes really important that, I mean, that's where it's permeating every aspect of his life. I would really encourage, maybe having him talk to somebody for him to learn what to do, because it sounds like it's really taking over. And to me, that's the concern, that it's not just, like where it's like just returning to school or something specific. It's really interfering in his ability, like you said, to enjoy everything that he used to enjoy. He's not wanting to do the things that he enjoyed. So that's when I tell parents, seek out professional help at that point, because we don't want him to continue like that. And if you intervene early, usually you can knock it out pretty quickly. Treatment doesn't usually last that long at that point, as opposed to letting it sit for a long period of time. Then it becomes ingrained, and so the idea is like you want him to feel empowered to be able to make a change.
Great, Doctor, thanks.
So the idea becomes, so what do we do to be able, and it sort of gets into like the whole idea of like, how do we treat anxiety? And so we do what's called exposures. So I showed you before about having that hierarchy. So the hierarchy was that thermometer. So we have that thermometer where we rate the anxiety. And so what we do is we create different scenarios of different situations that are anxiety provoking. So we have it from like 1, so we rate it from 1 to 10, things that are easier versus harder. And then we want to expose them to situations that are difficult, right? So we're not going to start on the thing that's the most difficult thing. So if you were afraid of snakes, I'm not going to throw you in a room with snakes and you'd be like, no way, we'll never be able to do that. Like, that's not what we're going to start with. So the idea is that we want to start with something that's more manageable, something easier for them to be able to do. And so the idea that happens is that when we start with something, what do we see? We call it habituation. So if you see on this slide, the first time you could see that the anxiety increases to peak distress really high, and eventually it levels off in time. By doing nothing, anxiety will go away. Next time you do it, anxiety will peak a little bit less, but eventually what happens? It goes down. But maybe by the 10th time of doing it, what happens? The peak comes even less and then takes less time to go down. And then maybe by the 20th time of doing it, maybe I'm not going to have any anxiety. And that's where like it's going to flatten the curve like totally down. And so that becomes the importance is practice makes perfect. Repeated exposures will to the same situation will allow the person to lower their anxiety and lower their distress to the point that that situation doesn't have to become stressful anymore. And then we move on to the next situation. And then we move on to the next situation. So it becomes repeated like homework assignments. So when I'm working with somebody, I'm doing exposures in session, and then they have homework assignments. If they have to do those homework assignments every single day. So if they practice every single day by doing these, what happens? Change happens quickly. So that they see that they're able to manage their anxiety, right? Not the fact that they're not going to ever be anxious. So if they're anxious doing something, the idea is if they learn that they don't have to avoid in order for them to be able to see that anxiety goes down. Anxiety goes down by itself, because that is the key factor that we want them to know. So what do you do if the child refuses to do the first step? And you have to realize that maybe it was too hard of a step. So we use smaller steps. And so it becomes really important is that you really want to make sure that you allow the child to be able to make it easier for themselves to be able to have that. So it's the idea of saying, oh, no, this is not going to work. I mean, we don't say that. We never say that. The idea becomes that maybe that it was too hard of a step for them. And we have to think about how do we encourage them. So sometimes for feared things, we have to use extra incentives. So sometimes, for young kids, I use something called a bravery bag. So a bravery bag is like, where we put different prizes in the bag and they get to pull something out when they do something brave. For older kids, maybe we give them tickets that they use to like turn in for a prize if they get to do. So the idea becomes that, again, it's not, they're not going to, when anybody is afraid, they're not going to do something just because you give them a prize. I remember I had a patient years ago who was, the parent was promising Disney World if the child got over their fear. You don't think that the child wanted to go to Disney World? Of course the child wanted to go to Disney World, but the fear was so great that the child still couldn't do it. So you could promise the moon and it's not going to happen just because you promised them something. So remember, the prize by itself is not the thing that's going to get them to be able to do the exposure or be able to get over the fear. The prize is just an added bonus, especially for young kids, to be able to help them feel that incentive to be able to try those small steps, to be able to see and then feel really good afterwards and proud. And you really want them, if you look at the STOP, P was not prize, it was praise, pat on the back, or proud. Because I really want them, even if they get a prize, I want them to have intrinsic motivation. I want them to feel really good about themselves for being able to do that, so that they see the progress that they made and they see that they were able to beat the anxiety and that they're not being controlled by their fear. And those are the kinds of things that we want them to be able to do. So it really helps to be able to sort of sometimes tie in the prize just to be able to do that, but realize that for a lot of kids, they're motivated by themselves because they don't want to have this fear. It doesn't feel very good. Especially that example where you're telling me that your son is not doing the things that he enjoys anymore. He, I'm sure, wants to get over his fears. He just doesn't know how to. So, a prize is not going to do that. But the idea is that, and it's just the fact of getting over the fear is what's going to be the most motivating for him of anything. But sometimes like having those little prizes can sometimes like be extra incentives at times. So the most important thing is that the goal of treatment is not to live anxiety-free, but instead learning how not to give into the anxiety and how not to let the anxiety interfere with your life. And I can't stress that enough, because to me, that's the most important thing, is that we don't live in an anxiety-free world. None of us do. We can't, it's just not, not reasonable. And actually for survival purposes, it wouldn't be reasonable either. And so the goal is not to be anxiety-free. And so the point is that we learn to be able to have anxiety, but recognize that it's not going to stop us from doing the things that are important to us. So obviously our kids have to go to school, or, we want our kids to learn, we want our kids to socialize, we want our kids to be able to do the things that are important to them. And so the idea is being able to find ways to get them to be able to see the things that they want to be able to do and not let anxiety stop them from doing those things. So that's what we really want to be able to do, is help them get there. And to me, that's the key to life, is living a valued life, is moving towards what's important to you rather than moving away from anxiety. And I think that's the key here, is saying, like, I'm not going to always move away from anxiety, because I can be anxious and I can still do the things that I like. And so, and what happens to anxiety when I do that? So can I have anxiety? Does anxiety become in the front of my face? Or can I have anxiety more in the background? And the idea becomes, if we live our life with anxiety more in the background, it doesn't take over. So yes, we can experience anxiety, but it gets muted. So it's not, so as opposed to if it's in front of our face, it's really, really loud and shouting. And that doesn't feel very good. So it becomes really important to be able to really recognize that it's not as if anxiety doesn't pop up, it pops up. But the reality is that we let it be and realize that it doesn't have, it's not predictive of catastrophe. But the idea that we talk about, I always talk about productive worry and unproductive worry. And so the idea becomes that we want to be able to have productive worry versus unproductive worry. And especially about returning to school, it becomes even more important to have that, what we call productive worry. So if your child is worried about something, then you talk about it in a way that says, like, okay, how do we problem solve around that? To me, maybe it's a legitimate worry, right? So maybe, you know, when you return to school, you have to think about, like, what are some of the situations that you want to be prepared for? So we plan for those situations. Okay, well, that's productive worry. But we don't want to plan for every eventuality that is unlikely. Then that's unproductive worry. So all those what ifs, what if, that leads to very unproductive worry. So, but the high likelihood things, well, that becomes more productive worry. And so to me, that becomes the important part of it. So hopefully you found that helpful. And I do want to open it up to the last 5 minutes for questions. So I'm hoping that you guys have a few questions that I can answer, and to be able to clarify some of the things, or be able to talk about more directly some of the things for your own children.
Doctor, I don't have anything additional in the chat box. Anybody else? Again, everybody is able to unmute themselves.
Does anybody want to ask something specific? I mean,
this is like
it out.
This is like free therapeutic advice, you know, guys.
Exactly.
Take it while you can get it. So I
purposely made the presentation a little bit shorter because I was expecting a smaller crowd so that I could do it more interactive.
Sure.
Because I know some of these other ones that I've done through webinars, there wasn't the opportunity. So I made it longer, so it went to the very end. So and I feel like it misses out. You know, I like being in person because I like the interaction. So
yeah, the interaction is a lot better.
Right. But I know people are shy about talking, and that's really the point.
There is a question coming, and while we're waiting for it to come, I will say, when you talked about anxiety, I was experiencing some anxiety a little while ago, and this is an announcement for the group. You showed the fear meter, and I was all the way up to the top, like 10.
Right.
To lift the line from Spinal Tap, I went to 11 because we did have a situation where one of the other workshops, no one could get into it.
Just want to let mine.
No, there was another one.
Okay.
It was even a bigger train wreck than yours.
Okay.
Now my fear meter just went up again, doctor. So you're not calming my anxiety.
Hey, but it worked out.
It did. It worked out.
That's why your anxiety goes down, because it worked out.
It did work out, but we just want to let everybody know that you check your emails, because we have, as part of this process, we have now decoupled the Zoom links from the Accel Events platform. So please check your email for the future workshops. You're going to be able to attend them directly by clicking on the link that you received in your email. Now, for the person who has a question, I think she would like to just ask it, so go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Salzman. Just a quick question. In terms of like balancing, like how we speak to the child and everything, because my concern is, like I'm trying to be like a calming force when I talk to my child, but I don't want to seem like I'm underreacting. So like when, he expresses the concerns, I certainly don't like make him panic, but I don't want to seem like I'm not caring enough when I try to just, like talk down a little bit, and just kind of like chill him out. So how do we make it seem so we're not uncaring and like it's like no big deal and seem insensitive, I guess?
How old is he?
He's 8.
So the idea becomes, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think it becomes you're touching on something that I didn't really get a chance to talk too much about. I mentioned in the very beginning, is that reassurance. And so it's the idea that you have to be, like, as parents, we definitely reassure our kids, but we have to find a fine balance between reassurance and what becomes maintaining anxiety. And so, I think the idea becomes making sure that you're hearing what their issues are, and also, like, to me, it's part of like active listening, like listening to it, but recognizing that you don't want to just say like there's no problems, because like some of their fears might be valid fears, but asking questions rather than telling them the answer. And so it becomes important, is like, so if your son is saying like, I'm worried about this, and you just say like, oh, it's going to be fine, that doesn't help him feel okay with it, right? So it doesn't tell him why it's going to be okay. So you could say like, what are you worried about happening? And then you can ask and say, well, like, why, like, has that ever happened? Or, what do we do to prevent that from happening? So ask a question to give him that confidence that like he knows the answer to why that, like, you're already, lowering that by you reassuring and saying, oh, like, oh, that's not gonna be a problem. Like, help him understand why you're saying that. But by you not giving the answer, by maybe asking a question, help your son get to there. So maybe by saying like, oh, well, what are we doing in school to help prevent that? What are your teachers doing, or what is the school doing?
Okay. And if I get, no, it makes sense. And then just to take it one step further, what if they say like, I don't want to talk about it because, they're kids. I don't want to talk about it. Like if you're trying to find out like, well, why is it that you feel this way, or what are you concerned about? Because again, they're kids. They don't want to talk.
Oh, so he's not bringing it up to begin with, you're saying?
No. Well, he is. Like, well, I mean, he'll say like he's afraid to do something, and like you said, like you ask the questions, like about.
Well, if he says he's afraid to do something, say I'm afraid to, do this math problem, and so say like, oh, well, what do you think will happen? Like I'm going to get it wrong, like, or like, and if he's not giving you the answers, you could say like, are you concerned about getting it wrong, or do you think other people are going to think something? Like sometimes I'll give them like, with young kids, sometimes I give them like a multiple choice. I don't want to give them the answer. I'll give them like some kid, like, is it like this, or this? So like I give them like 3 choices, like a multiple choice, so that maybe like they'll pick one of them rather than, giving me just yesing me to get me to stop. So sometimes that might be a way that you could do it, rather than just an open-ended question of saying like, oh, why are you afraid of that? Because sometimes they don't always have the words to know why.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like I've given options, and like, I try to get it out of him, and it's, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. So.
But then I would say like, well, but you're saying you're afraid. So talking about it, maybe we could get an answer to be able to help you so that you're not afraid. Like, I want to be able to help you with it. So, I mean, if you don't like, so part of it is encouraging him to say like, maybe are you afraid by talking about it that it's going to make you more worried? Like maybe by talking about it, we can come up with a plan to lower your anxiety.
Okay, thank you so much.
It's helping him figure out because I think a lot of kids, I mean, I think that's a perfect example of a lot of kids maybe don't want to talk about it because at the moment their anxiety goes higher in that moment. And so by them seeing that talking about it can actually lower their anxiety in the end, because they come to an answer for themselves. Oh, okay, yeah, no, that's that makes sense. Like then they feel better in the end result.
Yeah, because actually when that's happened, then he starts to get nervous and say, I'm gonna be sick. So when I've said like, oh, like what is it about that? And then that's when, like what you just said, it gets worse.
Yeah. So that's why he doesn't want to talk about it, because it makes him anxious to talk about it.
Yeah.
So he needs to understand that talking about it might be anxiety provoking in the beginning, but hopefully the goal is that he's going to be less anxious in the end. So that you hit it exactly, right? So that's the point. So you have to figure out what, so he's expressing himself, but then he's avoiding. And so the idea becomes, so having that conversation saying, oh gosh, like, yeah, I get that you don't want to talk about it because it probably makes you anxious right now. And so, but I wonder if we could talk about it for 5 minutes and maybe knock it out. And sometimes the other thing that I help kids with is like name the fear as like a separate entity. Like say like, okay, like, you know, so rather than it just being called anxiety or fear, is like, you know, call it a name, you know, like the monster or the bully or some, you know, they come up with all different names. So like, let's fight back. And so like, if we're fighting back the bully, then sometimes they're like, it's easier than fighting in their own head. So like, what is the bully saying? Like, what is the, you know, bully telling you? And like, let's like figure out how we can argue back to the bully. So that sometimes helps too, is changing that tone of it to that conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So I appreciate everybody.
Thank you for doing it. Go ahead, Deb.
No, I was going to just say, like, I appreciate
Doctor.
everybody participating. I appreciate everybody coming, and I'm glad for the few questions that people asked. I hope you found it helpful. So you know, I do.
I for one thought it was. I thought it was great. I mean, I came out of the bullpen for Christina, who had to take care of some of the technical difficulties. So the last half or 2/3 that I saw, I thought was great. You know, I thought a lot of good practical advice. So thanks for being here and doing this. Guys, we are going to have about a 30-minute break before the next session, so you can go grab some lunch or whatever. We have put out, unlike some conferences you've been to, we have not put out box lunches or like cold cuts. We've got filet mignon. We've got salmon. I mean, we've got everything out there you can like. So go help yourself down the hall, you know, in the lunchroom in the main hall, and grab yourself some good eats. Until then, I'll see you all at 12:30. Dr. Salzman, thank you again for being here.
All right, take care. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you for watching this encore presentation from the Fall 2020 Hinkle, Pryor and Fisher Parent Empowerment Conference. With 24 other presentations to view, there is plenty of additional information to help you become empowered. As a reminder, the information contained in this video is not a substitute for individual legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Copyright 2020 Hinkle, Pryor and Fisher, PC, Attorneys at Law. All rights reserved.